Good morning. This is part two of the psychology of doing wrong. About a third of this is going to be revision and paraphrasing of the important things that we've already looked at, some of them, and then the rest is going to be new stuff to round off this topic area. Ethical frameworks in reverse order. Results are the most important thing in consequentialism, of which the most important example was act utilitarianism. Make your ethical decision in order to achieve what is going to be the greatest good of the greatest number. That's all about results. And then we have in the middle here the rule utilitarianism, deontology, strict liability rules in the law, such as speeding. Doesn't matter whether you weren't meant to or what the result was, either you are speeding or you're not. That's strict liability. The Kant categorical imperative, KCI, and universalism, which I'm going to come back to in a second. The act itself is what decides the ethical rating of the decision. The act itself is either good or bad under a deontology type of framework. And one that we haven't really done yet is where motive is the most important thing. So what you think about before making the decision and doing the act. And there we've got virtue ethics, which I'm introducing today, care theory, which I'm doing next week, relativism, which is the idea introduced already that ethics are a function of geography. Where you are is what determines what's good or bad. And the criminal law in common law jurisdictions, because in order to convict somebody of a crime, you have to show that they had a guilty intention. And a guilty intention can include negligence. But if they had a good intention, then it's quite hard to get them successfully convicted of a crime in a common law jurisdiction. So, three types of framework: before, during, and after. Before, focusing on motive. During, focusing on the act itself. And after, focusing on the results of the act. That's revision, really. Next, also revision, are ethical values universal? This is important. I've got a question on it in the assignment, and I'm likely to have something pretty similar in the exam itself, so really get your heads around this one. If ethical values are universal and they apply to everybody, indeed everything, here and everywhere else, now and every time else. Kohlberg says yes, if they're not universal, they're not ethics. Kant says yes, pretty much the same thing. If they're not universal, they're not ethics. Religion says yes, everybody is bound by ethics. By ethics, they mean the particular codes of behavior towards each other. They don't mean the particular rituals inside the religion. And the United Nations says yes in its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's not really universal because it only applies to humans, but it's universal for humans. Care theory, next week. Utilitarians, egoists, existentialists, anthropologists say no. They say ethics is a set of beliefs that is conditioned completely by the history, geography, culture, and culture includes religion here, of the society in which you are. Higher relativism, a bit like the UN Declaration, includes all humans, but even higher relativism includes all living things. And higher relativism includes all the frameworks. All frameworks are relativistic in the sense that they only apply to humans, except for Buddhism, which applies to all life. There are other frameworks that also apply to all life, but they're not fully fledged frameworks yet. Buddhism is a fully fledged religious framework. Ideas like original sin in the Christian tradition, and particularly the Catholic one, where the idea is that man was born innocent, but then when the serpent tempted Eve, tempted Adam, then that was the original sin, and that in order to get God's forgiveness for your own sin and for the whole of humanity to get forgiven for original sin, there is salvation. And the implication is that salvation is a precondition of virtue. God's grace has got to be there first in that view. Then professional ethics are relativist because a profession is only one part of a society. And I've added on this slide, but see, quote unquote, Black Easter scenarios. Just very briefly, what are they? James Blish, B-L-I-S-H, wrote a small science fiction story, about 100 pages, called Black Easter. And in Black Easter, the devil succeeds in overthrowing God, and the devil becomes God. And it turns out that hardly anybody sees any difference, because in order to run things, the devil finds out has to make nearly all the same decisions that God had made. And while the devil wants to see a lot of human suffering, he didn't want everybody to die out, because then he'd have nobody to play with. So even though his motive was opposite to God, what he actually did was quite the same. So a Black Easter scenario is one which says apparent differences may disappear when the alternative, the underdog, the revolutionary, takes power. Some people say that in modern politics of the world, what's happening in El Salvador is an example of this, where the revolutionary ends up as the indistinguishable almost from the dictator that he overthrew 25 years ago. We don't really want to get into that, but that is an example of a Black Easter scenario. Karma in Eastern traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, implies universalism, because the implication is that all human beings live again, all human beings accumulate debits and credits for their good deeds and bad deeds, which they pay off in future lives, and that their happiness or unhappiness in this life is to a certain extent paying off good or bad things in past lives. That's a universalist view, because for it to be a relativist view, there would have to be the assumption, the promulgation even, that some people were exempt from karma. And neither Hinduism nor Buddhism says that. It says we all got it. Revolutions imply relativism. Why? Because when you overthrow a government and you've got a different ideology, in the last 100 years that's usually communism, but occasionally it was fascism, then your ethical framework is quite different in material aspects from the framework of the people that you've overthrown. So those are the main threads in a discussion that you might be asked to write an essay about, as to whether ethics is universal or relativistic. Of course, there's no right answer, but there are good arguments and bad arguments, and if you have to write an essay on this topic, we're looking for the good arguments. And I'll tell you in a separate tutorial what I think good arguments look like. Psychology and ethics, we've introduced that. Motives imply control, because if you're minded to do something, if you're motivated to do something, there must be a certain amount of internal locus of control, because otherwise, why bother? So to bother at all implies some control. Criminal acts, however, can be irrational and completely under the influence of drink or drugs, or unconscious. So an excuse in law is that you didn't know what you were doing for medical or drug or drink related reasons, and therefore you can't really have had the motive. So it's quite possible for bad things to happen. You might go further than saying it's possible. You might say it's even usual, because people aren't controlling or cannot control their irrational impulses. Now, consequentialists, greatest good of the greatest number, and deontologists, what counts as the act itself, say motive is irrelevant to what's good or what's right. But people who believe motive counts, of course, say the opposite, and virtue ethics is the main framework that says this one, which we're doing a bit later this morning. The motivation to commit a crime overlaps with the motive for old-fashioned sin. Sin was an offence against God and religion, whereas crime is an offence against the law of the land. A survival mentality has an amoral, or amoral if you prefer, disregard for the ethical content of actions. Sociopaths, psychopaths, or reptilian people, so-called reptilian mindsets, cold-blooded, don't have right or wrong as a consideration at all. It's my survival. I'm hungry, I eat you, if I'm a croc. I want power. I don't care if I destroy you in getting there. Psychopath. I need to see the doctor, so I'm going to force my way to the front of the queue. Sociopath. So those three categories have a survivalist excuse for not having proper ethics. The sanctions for people who do bad or wrong things are the fear of discovery and of punishment. The punishment has got to be painful enough to be an incentive, and the probability of discovery has got to be great enough to act as a deterrent to bad behaviour. And this is the police problem. Fear of discovery is only going to work if you're in a very strong dictatorship, everybody under surveillance, like the novel 1984, and very efficient police, and everybody spying on everybody else. Now, nobody wants to live in that kind of society. But for each degree of freedom that you have in a society, so you're allowing some crime to take place, because you don't want to be everywhere at the same time, surveying everybody and having people dob in the people they don't like, rightly or wrongly. We don't want that kind of society. So in a free society, there is a certainty of crime, because some crime can be got away with, because surveillance and monitoring aren't going to be total. We're not going to be totalitarian. We're in a free society. Guilt, looked at last time, let's revise it. Guilt presupposes a conscience, so it's no use to psychopaths, sociopaths and reptiles. It presupposes the possibility of sympathy, empathy, or seeing the victim's point of view enough to feel some pain. Now, sympathy means you can feel the pain, or at least imagine it, of the injured party. Empathy is much stronger. Empathy means you can put yourself in their shoes and have a good idea, more generally, what it's like to be them. So the proposition is most of us have sympathy, but empathy is a slightly rarer gift, because empathy involves putting yourself fully in their shoes. So if you're a man, then empathy for a woman who is having the pain of childbirth would be very difficult, because you're never going to have an experience anything like it. And if it's your wife or your partner, then you'll have great sympathy and you'll probably feel their pain. But it'd be rather hard to have empathy, because you don't have that kind of body in the first place. Next, guilt. It can be engendered by the superego, which is the psychologist's term for conscience, superego voicing as the voice of conscience, or by inner parent. Freud in particular thought that conscience was simply your internalization of what your parents had told you, in particular what they'd told you in a negative way not to do, the inner shouting parent. Guilt can arise from failure to act, failure to protect, and from looking on instead of intervening. So that guilt doesn't necessarily mean guilt about doing something. It can just as easily be guilt about not doing something. And guilt doesn't necessarily prevent recurrence. For example, many domestic violence cases, guys getting drunk and beating up their partner and worse still their kids. Very sincere guilt, tears, repentance, but not enough to stop them doing it again. So guilt can be quite powerful, but in serious cases, it isn't necessarily powerful enough. Shame. Shame is the pain of others knowing and looking down on you for your bad act. It's stronger in relativistic frameworks than in universalist ones. If you're a deontologist, then you're doing right and you have moral courage to stand up against everybody else. Whereas if you're a relativist, then behaving appropriately and doing what society or your particular group approves of is crucial. So, the more you're in a relativistic situation, the more important shame is as a weapon to deter people from bad behaviour. Shame depends on fear of ostracism, fear of exile, or fear of excommunication. In other words, it's critically Kohlberg level 3 and rests on people's need to feel that they belong somewhere and mortal fear of being kicked out of the group to which they belong if they behave badly. So quite powerful. It's stronger in the East than the West because face is more important in the East than the West. Face is important in some parts of the West as well, particularly if you're an ambitious person in your career. But it's not as fundamental to the value system as happens in the East in general. India strongly, very strongly indeed in China, whether it's under capitalism or under communism. Absolutely basic. And the idea of guanxi, of your connections of group, reinforces it. Of course, it's not the same thing. Face is the issue there. It's a major driver in care theory, in professional ethics, and communities held together by fear or by very strong relationship bonds. So, whenever we're talking about a group of any kind, from family outwards to society as a whole, shame is an important weapon. It can only be resolved by explicit forgiveness, which may require atonement, repentance first. And it can be abused by authority, by making somebody thoroughly ashamed who's completely innocent. The French case of Dreyfus, the Jewish officer who was the victim of anti-Semitism and was cashiered and disgraced, and it took the writer Émile Zola to get him reinstated, and that took 10 years. The point there is that shame is a very powerful weapon, and like any other weapon, it can be abused in the wrong hands. So, what is the salience? What is the effectiveness of deterrence? The stronger your imagination, the more vividly the wrongdoer can visualize the situation in which she gets caught and punished. So, part of the ingredients of effective deterrence is that the victim has a good imagination. Secondly, immediacy. How far away is the discovery and punishment reckoned to be? So, If you're stealing something from a shop, if you're shoplifting, if you suddenly discover there's closed circuit TV or a store detective right behind you, that's very immediate, and you're going to be deterred from your shoplifting because you're just about to certainly get caught and therefore face some kind of punishment. Immediacy is important. In other contexts, instead of using the word immediacy, they use the word proximity, but it's not quite what we mean here. Proximity has an extra edge, which we'll deal with when we deal with stakeholders later on. Third one, agency. How much the influence of any wrongdoer can rely on to deflect discovery or punishment. In other words, if you say you're doing it under orders or somebody else told you to, and it's effectively an external locus of control situation, then you'll be less deterred because you'll be trying to use the rationalization or justification, depending whether it's before or after, that you didn't have all that much choice. Next one. Desperation, survivalism, excuses, nothing left to lose. So if you think you've got nothing left to lose and you're therefore desperate, and you say it's a matter of your own survival or your family's survival, then you won't be deterred from doing wrong, because all those things will trump the rating that you give to the doing of wrong. Then anger, revenge, if you think you've been the victim of injustice, or your kid has, or your family member, then you want revenge. Revenge is a very powerful natural motive amongst higher animals, including ourselves, who are higher animals in many, many, many respects. And then lastly, the utilitarian balancing of risk on the one hand with the pain, the risk of pain against the prospect of pleasure. So if you're a thrill seeker, the prospect of pleasure will weigh more heavily with you than the risk of pain, punishment, discovery. And so, again, you won't be deterred. So many factors there, and they're not all of them, though they're just 6 I've picked out which are quite important, that go into assessing whether deterrence is effective in stopping people doing what is considered to be a wrong or bad thing. Now, as we move towards virtue, we go via religion. Every religion has its code of ethics. Most atheistic frameworks prefer what is natural. Taoism, great believer in the Tao, and what is natural, going with the flow, is a cliche we get in the very first place from Taoism. Darwinism, what is natural is survival of the fittest, the strongest survive, and no point in going against nature because we ourselves are animals. Whereas many ethical frameworks, particularly one like Kant, says going against nature is the whole point, otherwise we are just animals, and we shouldn't even use the word civilization at all if we're not prepared to transcend our animal nature. Existentialism, which sounds a lot more complex than it really is, existentialism boils down to the belief that you are most fulfilled when you act in your own nature to be yourself, and don't be hypocritical, don't act against your natural instincts, be authentic. That's existentialism. And most versions of relativism. Most versions of relativism tie up with a belief that what they're believing, what they're advocating is natural. Almost everyone agrees that unselfishness and service to others is a good. In fact, you could say it's a virtue. Selfishness, arrogance, murder, theft, and deceit are bad. Almost all frameworks, almost all countries agree with that. The place of life is problematic relative to pain, and human life relative to other life. Consider the question of abortion, as the Americans are doing at the moment, particularly in Texas. If the right to life is much more important than the right to avoid pain, then abortion is murder and that's it. If, on the other hand, a woman's right to choose is based on her right to avoid pain, then so long as the abortion takes place before life is considered to really begin, then that's the opposite view from the traditional Catholic one. And these views are, of course, head-on opposed to each other. When does life really begin? The Texas law says it's when there is a heartbeat. Many other jurisdictions say when there is a fully formed fetus capable of movement, which is like week 20 or so. Then, is God good because he is the sovereign over the whole universe, and therefore, if it's anything God said, it's inherently good because God is the source of all goodness? Or is the idea of goodness something that transcends even God, so that God himself would be bound by some universal eternal good, and that therefore God himself in that scenario could sin? In traditional religion, especially Christianity, that is impossible. In fact, it's an oxymoron. But for those people who aren't traditional faithful Christians, the question can be asked: is there the idea of good, universal, above and beyond God if God exists? So it's an important question to ask and consider. Most ethical frameworks believe that they are furthering justice. And when we hear the word justice, we are usually thinking of one of the three versions of justice, and they are quite different from each other. First, there's procedural justice. That's natural justice. Natural justice has the idea that a fair procedure is one where you hear both sides of an argument, you take all the evidence into account and ignore hearsay, you ensure due process, and it springs from an innate sense of justice, that we're all born with an innate sense of justice. This is a virtue ethics position. But many frameworks have a belief in natural justice, and the ingredients thereof are what I've just listed there. Next one, social justice. When we say it's not fair, when we're complaining about something, we tend to mean social justice. That's substantive. That is, it's about actual things, assets, goods, and distributive. Who has more, who has less? Distribution of assets and goods. It's got the assumption that everyone is equal in rights and entitlements, and it has the maxim in common law from long ago British heritage from the time of Henry I, actually. Equity is equality. In other words, fairness and equality are connected. If you're a communist, then you regard that as completely self-evident. If you're a strong capitalist, then you'd say, well, that's not true at all. If people work harder or if they're more gifted, they deserve to have more. So social justice is something that suffuses people's political beliefs and their party affiliation too. Third one, legal justice. Justice in common law jurisdictions means applying the rules of equity to cases which themselves arose from conscience and usually coincide with one or both of the above. So when a lawyer or judge talks about equity, they're talking about those rules of law that have been handed down in the courts, and they tend to be rules that say, even though a statute passed by Parliament, Assembly, Congress says X, equity demands that X is applied fairly and mercifully in case Y. So most of the time when we're talking about justice, we're going to be talking about some view of social justice. Sometimes we're going to be talking about natural justice. Natural justice is a matter of procedure. Social justice is a matter of substance. But all ethical frameworks believe, and indeed some of them explicitly state, that they are about increasing the amount of justice in the world. So it's a concept that you have to get your head round, and there is no one right answer, but there are these central tendencies, we may say. Jurisprudence is the philosophy underlying the law, Kohlberg 4, law of the land. The strong form of natural law is Aquinas' saying, St. Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic Church in the 1200s, an unjust law isn't a real law. The idea that a real law is fair and just. Weak form of this view is that you can have a law which is defective, but under the rule of law, you've got to obey it anyway. That's quite important. That if you believe in the rule of law, that includes the defective laws, not just the ones you agree with, of course not. Positivism, that is, looking at what is rather than what ought to be. Positivist jurisprudence, early thinkers, Austin and Bentham famous for utilitarianism. And Austin introduced the idea that it's the sovereigns who make the law. Well, everybody knew that. Rather like God giving the Ten Commandments. And so what we consider to be lawful, never mind what we consider to be right, but what we consider to be lawful is a matter of what the sovereign has proclaimed and declared. Law comes from the sovereign. That's the Austinian view. The next one is deceptively similar to that, but is actually really different. Kelsen, early in the last century, has the idea of a basic norm, and a basic norm that gives validity and legality to all individual laws and judge-made cases. Kelsen's basic norms are enshrined in a constitution. In the case of places that don't have written constitutions like the UK, key documents from history like the Bill of Rights, like Magna Carta. And for Australia, which was effectively a dominion of Britain, the British version applies to Australia so far. In Hong Kong, when Margaret Thatcher gave Hong Kong back to China, there was a big fanfare about there being a basic law there which would determine how Hong Kong law was maintained and implemented. And we've seen in the last 2 years that that really didn't mean anything. Because China regarded its security as being threatened in Hong Kong, and it said it's part of China, and therefore we've got the right to make sure we are secure. Basic law in Hong Kong said there will be democracy and it will be progressively introduced. That's what the basic law said. That didn't happen. So Kelsen's view often does apply, that there are basic norms, basic constitutions, basic codes of ethics. Professions certainly seem to follow a Kelsen trajectory, but it doesn't always work as happens in Hong Kong. Then there's Hart, H.L.A. Hart, who said, law is whatever judges recognise by their own so-called rules of recognition to be law. I regard that as a cop-out, because it begs the question, what do the judges recognise? How do they recognise them? You can't just simply external locus of control say what's the law is whatever the judges say it is. Because in terms of implementing the law in a court, of course that's true, it's also tautologous. It doesn't get us anywhere. But a lot of legal philosophers pay a lot of respect to H.L.A. Hart's view. It's pragmatic to the point of vacuity, in my personal opinion. Confucius, the most famous Chinese philosopher, held that virtue is opposed to law because, in a society of virtuous people, judges wouldn't be needed to resolve disputes. Well, that's rather like efficient market hypothesis in finance theory. It would be a very good thing if it happened, but there has never been a society of virtuous people, and so there has always been the need for judges. So while Confucius's postulate may well be right, it cannot be tested in our lifetime or in the 2,000 years between his lifetime and ours, because we haven't yet got a society of virtuous people under any definition of virtue. And now we get to virtue ethics themselves. Virtue ethics is not about what I should do, but what I should be like. And because it's what I should be like, it is in some cases called the agency basis or the agent basis of ethics, because it's me as an agent and what my character should be. It takes the generally accepted virtues and vices as the basis for ethical reasoning. Moral character is demonstrated by habitual acts, like habitually being honest. So the great strength of virtue ethics relative to the other frameworks is that it's got to be habit, it's got to be repeated, it's about the person, it's not just the act, it's not just one decision. So it's not piecemeal and reductionist in the way that the others are. It's whole of person. A virtue is acquired, not intrinsic. So its development and its maintenance is praiseworthy. Big writer in business ethics called Velasquez in America said that. Virtue ethics is generally thought to have begun with the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He said, a moral person acts on reason, system 2, cortex, not thalamus, and you display reason by taking the middle way, for example, between recklessness on the one hand and cowardice, whereas for Aristotle, a vice is an extreme or of lack or an extreme of excess. So as far as he is concerned, prudence, the middle way, is knowing what's reasonable in any given situation and is the top virtue. That's just his view. Not just his view, but it doesn't bind anybody else. It's a perfectly okay view in his context. This is the same slide on a different graph. This is a different one. It's possible anybody can draw up a list of virtues and say these are the virtues in virtue ethics. So the Stanwicks, who've written quite a good book called Understanding Business Ethics, it's in Pearson, that a lot of other universities use as their basic business ethics textbook. They say virtues are possess humility, self-explanatory, care about the greater good, that is, have a sense that there is such a thing as society and a public interest, be truthful, self-explanatory, fulfill commitments, don't break promises, take responsibility for your actions, have respect for the individual. This is something that overlaps with Kant, who said you must treat people as ends, not means. You mustn't just use people. So there he parts company with utilitarianism in quite a big way, quite apart from the lesser levels of Kolbe. It's virtuous to develop others. This is the Stanwicks rather than anybody else. It is virtuous to develop others. It's not generally highlighted as a primary virtue. Reproach unjust acts. Have the courage to speak out against injustice. Be forgiving. Extend self for others. Do things for other people. And celebrate the good fortune of others. In other words, don't be jealous. If you look on LinkedIn, or if you think about your own workplace, and if I think about the university, celebrating the good fortune of others is something that happens a lot in regular meetings. And of course, it's a good thing for building team spirit so long as it's done fairly and everybody who does something good gets praised. If it's not done like that, then you create jealousy and hatred, and that's not a good thing at all, obviously not. So I don't prescribe what the virtues are because different writers have slightly different ideas. Humility is always there, prudence is always there, courage is always there. Unselfishness of one sort or another is always there. Then it varies a little bit between one person and another. So we've got to think about what are virtues. The great weakness of virtue ethics is it takes virtues for granted as inherited from the past or being somehow natural judgments, and they're not necessarily. There might be general consensus about a few of them, but only a few. So it may not be enough as a guide. And now, the 7 deadly sins. These come from traditional Christianity, but not from the Bible. Pope Gregory the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and the medieval church were primarily responsible for developing them. And during the Middle Ages, people thought that if they did bad things, they would go to hell after they died. And doing bad things meant exhibiting at least one of the 7 deadly sins. So, what was considered sinful? Because although we're not medieval anymore, and we don't, on the whole, believe in sin anymore unless we're religious, we still have the idea that these particular things are bad. So, in no particular order, anger, that's bad. Losing control, shouting at people, etc., tends to be associated with violence. But righteous anger, by definition of righteous, is okay. So there's a big exception to the rule. Anger is a sin unless it's righteous, like when Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple, that was righteous anger. And God would periodically get angry with people and threaten punishment and actually impose punishment. So it's not all anger is bad. So there's a bit of a mixed message. Anger is bad unless it's righteous. What's righteous? Doing the right thing. Well, who says what that is? Your religion, your ethical framework. Oh, what about relativism? Yes, problem there. Next one, gluttony. That means greed. Greed means overdoing pleasures. Greed is grabbing onto things that you don't really need, overeating, overdoing pleasures in every other sense. And its twin is something different, which is avarice, the next one. Avarice means holding on, hoarding, not letting go. Mean, being mean. Avarice and gluttony often do go together, of course, but they're not the same thing at all. Gluttony is getting stuff you haven't got, and it's a motive force behind stealing. Avarice, holding on to things and being mean and turning a blind eye to suffering. It could be argued that our society encourages avarice. It doesn't encourage us to be charitable, to give to charity, or to look after people worse off than ourselves, although it pays lots of lip service to that. Sloth. Laziness, shirking, taking risky shortcuts. Our society is very much against that. We're encouraged to take exercise, go out, do things. So one way of rebelling these days against society is by being slothful, which is fine so long as you don't expect to convince anybody else that way. But it is an effective rebellion because our society is so against that. I would almost want to argue that as far as our society is concerned, the deadliest of the old 7 deadly sins is this one: sloth, laziness, shirking, not working hard, avoiding your duty, avoiding your responsibility, taking risky shortcuts. That's sloth. Next one, envy, jealousy, making adverse comparisons, starting and spreading malicious gossip about rivals, about people you don't like. You might think, well, this is prevalent throughout our society as well. And of course, you'd be right, especially if you're working in academia or you're in a firm where the people who sell the most get promoted, or are in a stockbrokers where people who make the biggest capital gains from short-term trading get the biggest money and the biggest praise. But I'm not just sure it's regarded as quite as bad as sloth. In fact, I would say in our society, envy is regarded as quite a good thing because it gives you the incentive to do better and to compete. Inherent in competition is that there will be envy as a spur to get you to compete more effectively. Lust, you'd think lust is sex, but it's not just sex. It's any drive where you feel you must have something. So it's associated with excessive shopping. It's not just sex at all, although it certainly includes all the not the sexual offences themselves, but the desire to commit or the inability to stop yourself committing the sexual offences. That's lust. And people in the Middle East and the Far East often see the West, and especially the United States, as having lust as their principal sin. But not so many people in the West would agree with that. They would say it's there, but it's not by any means something that everybody's got. It's not even something that every male has got. But it doesn't just mean lust for sex. It means... So it's quite close, really, to greed, gluttony. You must have something, and lust is also must have something. So lust actually, I would suggest, overlaps pretty heavily with gluttony, and there are some areas where you wouldn't know which you're talking about, like you must have a new dress, or you must have a new car, or you must have a new iPhone, when you need none of those things. Is that gluttony or is that lust? Well, arguably it's both. And then, in historical times, the worst sin, the deadliest sin, was thought of to be pride. That's why I put it in capitals on here. And pride comes in various forms. Vanity, looking at yourself in the mirror and thinking how pretty you are. Arrogance, thinking you're better than somebody else. That's pretty widespread. But it was widespread then as well. Throughout human history, arrogance has been pretty prevalent. Racism, thinking that your race is the best relative to others, and that therefore you can have privileged treatment, and other races can be enslaved, made subject to apartheid, or put in gas chambers. So pride is pretty deadly. It's probably deadlier than most of the others, although if it's allied to anger, that's a very deadly combination. Now, virtues aren't the polar opposite of these sins. They're a different combination. We'll leave that one till another day. Might do it next time. If we were thinking about 7 deadly sins today, well, there's no particular reason to stop at 7 just for a start. We might think about deceit, cold-blooded murder. Notice that in medieval times, murder wasn't considered a sin, partly because the 10 Commandments said thou shalt not kill. So That took care of it. I also said, thou shalt not steal, so don't have to have that as a sin. That was the reasoning. Atheism wasn't considered a sin, as heresy would get you burnt at the stake anyway, but it wasn't explicit that it was a sin. Drunkenness, we'd certainly consider that a sin if it leads to violence these days. Incest, self-evidently a sin. It's not in that list, and it's not necessarily the result of lust. You can have a brother and sister in love with each other. Cowardice, interesting, because cowardice is obviously a weakness, and courage is generally listed amongst the virtues traditionally and now. And the opposite of courage is cowardice. Yet, cowardice doesn't make it to the 7 deadly sins. So there's an asymmetry between the virtues and the sins. But an exercise that's well worth doing, and I think I've set you it in either the essay or the exam, is what would you say the deadly sins are or the main virtues are these days, and give your reasons for saying so. And with that, we come to the end of lecture 3B. Next time, new ethical frameworks, particularly care theory, but I'll do a little expansion of this stuff as well and a little revision as well for next time. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.